Let's talk about what might just be the biggest, most enduring question humanity has ever asked. Now, we're not going to solve it today. People have been wrestling with this for thousands of years. But what we are going to do is take a tour of the most powerful arguments on all sides. Think of it as a toolkit for understanding this massive, profound conversation. This isn't some abstract little puzzle. The answer, or even the search for an answer, has built and destroyed empires. It's inspired some of the world's most incredible art, and it shapes the daily lives of billions of people. It's pretty much the ultimate question about who we are and where we fit in the universe. So just to be super clear, my goal here isn't to convince you of anything. Not at all. Think of this as an intellectual road trip, where we visit the biggest, most famous arguments that thinkers have built over the centuries. Our goal here is clarity, not conversion. Ready to jump in? Let's do it. Okay, so here's our game plan. We're going to start by looking outward, at the massive universe itself. Then we're going to turn inward and look at our own moral compass. After that, things get a little weird, and we'll dive into the world of pure logic. Then we'll have to face the toughest challenge to belief, the problem of pain. And to wrap it all up, we'll step back and ask a really important question about the rules of this whole debate. All right, so this first set of arguments starts with something so obvious we barely even think about it. The universe is here. Stuff exists. But the big question is, why? And that simple question right there launches us straight into one of the oldest and most famous arguments for God. This is the cosmological argument, and the version you're seeing was really popularized by the philosopher William Lane Craig. The logic is pretty straightforward. Step 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. I mean, that makes sense, right? Your phone had a cause, the tree outside your window had a cause. Step 2, the universe began to exist. Modern science, especially the Big Bang Theory, points to this. So, step 3, therefore the universe itself must have a cause. And this cause would have to be something timeless, spaceless, and unbelievably powerful. But hold on, because right away we hit a huge roadblock put up by thinkers like Bertrand Russell and David Hume. They attack the whole thing at its foundation, at that very first step. They ask, why does that rule, everything needs a cause, have to apply to the universe itself? Maybe, just maybe, the universe is the one exception, the one thing that just is, no explanation needed, a brute fact. So, a similar but slightly different idea is the argument from design. The philosopher William Paley came up with this really famous analogy to explain it. Imagine you're walking on a beach and you find a watch. You'd look at all its tiny gears and springs working together and you'd immediately know someone made it. It wasn't just created by the waves. So the argument goes, now look at the universe. Look at the insane complexity of a DNA molecule, or the fine-tuning of the laws of physics. Doesn't that also scream designer? Now, for a lot of people, the biggest challenge to that watchmaker idea came from Charles Darwin. His theory of evolution by natural selection was a total game changer. It offered this incredible alternative, a purely natural process that could create the illusion of design without any designer needed. It suggested that all this complexity doesn't come from the top down, but instead bubbles up from the bottom, just through the simple, powerful logic of survival. Okay, so those first arguments looked out at the universe. This next line of thinking shifts the focus from planets and animals to something much more personal, our own sense of right and wrong, our conscience. This one's called the moral argument, and it makes a really bold claim. It says that for something like, say, torturing a child to be objectively wrong, and by that I mean wrong for everyone, everywhere, not just our opinion, then there has to be some kind of ultimate transcendent standard of good to measure it against. And the argument concludes that standard can only be God. Without God, morality is basically just a matter of opinion. But this idea runs into a super famous philosophical puzzle that goes all the way back to Plato. It's called the Euthyphro dilemma, and it's a real brain twister. It asks this: is something good just because God says it is? If so, couldn't God just decide that cruelty is good tomorrow? That makes morality seem kind of random. But what about the other option? Does God command something because it's already good? Well, if that's the case, then it sounds like goodness is a standard that exists outside of God, which totally undermines the original argument. It's a real catch-22. All right, get ready, because we're heading into the most abstract, most mind-bending argument of the bunch. This one doesn't need any evidence from the outside world, no stars, no morality. It tries to prove that God exists using nothing but pure logic. Yeah, you heard that right. This is the ontological argument, first thought up by a guy named Saint Anselm, and it's totally unique because it starts with just a definition. As you can see, we start by defining God as a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. In other words, the absolute greatest, most perfect being you could possibly imagine. So get that idea in your head. Now answer this question. Which is greater, a being that only exists in your mind or a being that exists in your mind and in reality? Well, Anselm's logic was, obviously, a real being is greater. So if God is the greatest conceivable being, then he must exist in reality. To exist only in the mind would be a limitation. But this is where the philosopher Immanuel Kant comes in with his famous counterpunch. Kant argued that existence isn't a property that makes something better, like being all-powerful or all-knowing. Think about it. Saying a $100 bill exists doesn't add any value to it. It just tells you that it's real. Existence isn't a feature of the concept, it's just a fact about it. Now, to make Kant's point a little easier to grasp, we can look at a parody from one of Anselm's own contemporaries, a monk named Gonyulo. He said, "Hey, if this logic works for God, I can use it for anything. Imagine a perfect island, the greatest, most amazing island you can possibly think of. Following Anselm's logic, that island must exist in reality because a real, perfect island is greater than an imaginary one. And since that's obviously absurd, Gonyulo said, there must be a flaw in the original argument." Okay, now we need to shift gears pretty dramatically. We've been looking at arguments for God's existence. Now we're going to tackle what many people feel is the single most powerful argument against it, the simple, brutal reality of evil and suffering in the world. This is the question, the one that keeps people up at night. If God is all-powerful, he could stop horrible suffering. If he's all good, he would want to stop it. And if he's all-knowing, he knows it's happening. So why doesn't he? The sheer amount of seemingly pointless suffering in the world, from a child getting a terminal illness to the horrors of war, it feels like a massive contradiction to the idea of a loving, all-powerful God. Now, in response to this huge problem, theologians have come up with explanations called theodicies, basically attempts to defend God. As you can see in the table, a really common one is the free will defense. The idea is that for love and goodness to be real, we have to be genuinely free, and that freedom means we have to have the ability to choose evil. The biggest critique of that, though, is that it doesn't really explain natural disasters, like earthquakes or tsunamis. Another idea is the soul-making defense, which suggests that suffering is what helps us grow and build character. But critics push back hard on that, asking, is this level of soul-crushing, gratuitous pain really necessary for that? All right, for our last section, we're going to zoom out a bit. We're not going to look at a specific argument for or against God, but instead at the rules of the debate itself. The big question is, who has to provide the proof? Bertrand Russell famously argued that the burden of proof always falls on the person making the positive claim, and he used this funny analogy of a celestial teapot. He said, imagine I told you there's a tiny little teapot orbiting the sun, way out between Earth and Mars, just too small for our telescopes to see. It wouldn't be your job to prove me wrong. It would be my job to prove I'm right. In the same way, he argued, it's up to the person who claims God exists to provide the evidence, not the other way around. But of course, there's a counterargument to that. Some thinkers push back and say that a purely scientific, materialist worldview is also a kind of faith position. They'd argue it requires blind faith, that the physical world is all there is, and that our human reason is the ultimate tool to figure everything out. So from this viewpoint, saying there is no God is just as big of a claim as saying there is a God, and both of them need some justification. And that really brings us right to the core of it all, doesn't it? We've looked at arguments from the cosmos, from our own conscience, from pure cold logic. We've grappled with the terrible problem of suffering, and we've even debated the rules of the debate. So it leaves us with this final question you see here. What kind of question is this really? Is God's existence a scientific hypothesis that's just waiting for the right evidence? Is it a logical puzzle we can solve with our minds? Or, in the end, will it always be in the realm of faith, a personal leap that goes beyond anything we can ever truly prove or disprove? The debate, as they say, continues.